Happy Thanksgiving. I am so grateful for you, the listener. I am so grateful that you tune in every morning, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. to the Morning Buzz. I'm live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter this morning. You can also visit Rumble. Yes, I wanted to do the show today because I've got a few things that I want to talk about. Not very news heavy this morning, but I did want to chat a little bit about the true story of Thanksgiving because I think that we all have this idea in our head when it comes to Thanksgiving. And it's like really this cartoonish idea that's in our head that is from grade school, whether we realize it or not. We have this image of the first Thanksgiving, and it's more or less the cartoon we were taught in grade school. But folks, the true story is far more interesting. And we're going to get to the true story here. But first, I did want to open. Yesterday was John F. Kennedy, the anniversary of his assassination. So, yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And for many people, we look at this university or this anniversary. We look at this and we look at it as the day they took our country away from us. That's how I look at this. And I've read a lot of books about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's something that's really fascinating. And, I know a lot of us scratch our heads every morning. How did we get here? How did we get here? I really think that it started uh, on the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated 60 years ago, yesterday, November 22nd, 1963. This is the day that the powers that be decided that we, the people, should not and could not govern ourselves. They couldn't allow a nationalist, populist president to take the reins and to steer us away from the path of war, to steer us away from the path of globalism, this global American empire. That's these these globalists, these cronies, this uniparty's dream. They want us on the path to globalism. Uh, they couldn't allow us to have a president to steer us away from the path of world domination. Instead, John F. Kennedy and other presidents have tried to institute real freedom, real elections in our nation, and to have the civilians determine their future and their direction, their path. JFK's assassination represents the birth of big government, the deprivation of rights. It represents the culmination of power by Washington, D.C. over the electorate. So after the assassination of JFK, I truly believe there's no longer this thing called the United States, but rather we became districts of the regime. And there was so much power given to Washington, D.C. And the regime, uh, mind you, that for many years, they've been content to run things behind the scenes, and there's various members of the Uniparty pulling the strings here. I know everybody's like, "Who's pulling the strings? It can't be Joe Biden. He's got dementia. There's no way that that old man is pulling the strings here." No, no, no. It's the Yankees and the Cowboys, and that's a term that I recently learned about from Human Events Jack Posobiec, and he was talking about how these two terms, these are the two mafias that are jointly controlling the country. Sure, they change out, leadership every 4 to 8 years. But when it comes down to it, the big questions were always off the table and the gutting of our country began. This is the uniparty. And we've had other presidents try to fight against the uniparty. Those presidents were also thrown out of office, smeared. Um, they were smeared and destroyed publicly. And then in 2016, a new candidate arose and he said, you know what, I'm going to take the country back from the corrupt insiders. And this was a man who never served in the military. This was a man who never served in government a day in his life. And for the first time in U.S. history, we elected a guy who didn't serve in the military, didn't serve in government in any kind of way. And they fought this guy. They fought Donald Trump every step of the way. They thought his victory would be impossible. And then he comes out and he wins. And then they spent the next 4 years trying to overturn and undo what the will of the people, Truly, that's what they were trying to do. And, we have an opportunity. We have a chance to set things right, to smash the uniparty duopoly. This is a duopoly. It's the Yankees and the Cowboys. I'm going to get to that here in just a little bit, but we have an opportunity to smash the national security state and to allow the people of this nation to once more determine the future uh, of themselves, of the country, and to determine the future of our descendants, generations to come. So 60 years ago yesterday, on November 22nd, that's 1963, that was the day we lost control of our country. And President Dwight Eisenhower, he actually, at the end of his second term, tried to warn us when he denounced the military industrial complex. He tried to warn us. And, I'd make the case to you that the CIA had their thumb on the scale in the 1960 election. They thought JFK would be, they believed strongly that he'd be more controllable than Richard Nixon. Why do you think that they put Joe Biden in? The Uniparty wants somebody they can control in office. I mean, Joe Biden can't even put on his shirt. Okay, can't even put on his own shirt. He can't probably even wipe his own butt. Okay, they can control Joe Biden. And they thought that JFK was going to be, they believed that he was more controllable than Richard Nixon. And then they would learn that 8 years later, Richard Nixon wasn't controllable either. And they would remove him. But in the case of John F. Kennedy, he was a passionate anti communist. He was a passionate anti communist. He favored a strong, big military buildup. And he actually had a very big, deep, deep distrust for the intelligence agencies because they misled him about the Bay of Pigs, which was this planned invasion of Cuba. And this was a fiasco. This was a fiasco. And the CIA, they had promised actually JFK, and we're going to dig into a little bit of history here. And I wasn't alive around this time. Maybe you were alive around this time, and text in 309-451-9299. But the CIA, they actually promised JFK that the men storming the beach, Bay of Pigs, that they would have air cover supplied by 29 Panamanian flag bombers, and these bombers were supposed to be piloted by Cuban pilots. Then the CIA, they quietly canceled that, so that way he would have to be, goaded into sending the U.S. Air Force to provide the men air cover. And they wanted him to do that because they wanted to provoke him into a war with Russia. So he had a deep distrust in the CIA. He distrusted the CIA because they lied to him about the Cuban Missile Crisis too. They lied to him about the Bay of Pigs. They lied to him about the Cuban Missile Crisis, where America was completely taken by surprise waking up one morning and they learned that Russians had actually placed these intercontinental ballistic missiles 90 miles from our shore. He could not be provoked into war. JFK, no matter what they did, how many times they lied to him, he was not going to be provoked into war, and he stood strong for America. He denounced the secret societies. So who do you think he was talking about when he denounced the secret societies? JFK. And so the murder of Kennedy is the absolute starting point of the deep state takeover of the American government. I truly believe that. People are left scratching their heads. They're like, when did we lose our country? When did we lose our country to the uniparty? Leftists, people on the right, the Bernie Sanders camp, the leftists who say and scream fascist. I actually agree with you. There is fascism, but it's not Donald Trump. It's not Donald Trump. It's not the conservative wing of the Republican Party. It's the Adam Kinsingers. It's the Ron DeSantises. It's the rhinos. Okay. It's these people. And I actually agree with you. And I think that we need to elect a nationalist populist president, and that is Donald Trump. Come on, lefties. I know we might not agree on everything. You might have purple hair and a nose ring, and you might scream for abortions, and I get that. But this is about the deep state and the takeover of the American government. And it all started with the murder of JFK, where the people who are elected they are no longer the people who have authority. Okay, the people who are elected in this country, they don't have authority. Everything is run by unelected bureaucrats, and that's down to the city government. Okay, I know because the planning commissions and they get to decide everything. The county government, McLean County, it's not your elected officials who have any kind of say over anything. It's the people who work, these unelected bureaucrats, in connection with their cronies and their special interests, particularly the defense industry, for example. But there's all kinds of special interests out there, and it's all ran by unelected bureaucrats right down to your city government. So I want to explain this a little bit, and it's a little bit different of a show this morning here on Cities 92.9. I'm not going to do a whole lot of news. I do want to talk about the assassination of JFK because this is real. The CIA, and I believe LBJ, actually is behind the the assassination of JFK. And the assassination of JFK, it was the starting point of the deep state taking over the American government. So when we come back, I got to take a quick break. I want to explain earlier in the show, I told you guys about the Yankee political corridor, and then there's the Cowboys. And I think this is a great explanation of the Uniparty. And I'm going to break that down for you here on the Buzz. And then a little bit later, I am going to talk about the true meaning of Thanksgiving and the true story of Thanksgiving. And I get it. We were all taught about the first Thanksgiving in grade school, but it's nothing like what we were taught in grade school. So I'm excited to talk about the Pilgrims, the Indians, the story here in the 7 o'clock hour. I'm probably going to get to it. I do want to finish out the 6 o'clock hour with the assassination of JFK because yesterday was the 60th anniversary of that assassination. And I think it's so important because people are scratching their heads like, Kat, why are we here? Why is this going on? It's because the assassination of JFK, that is when we lost our country. And that is when the deep state took over. So I'm back next. This is Cities 92.9. Happy Thanksgiving. Good morning, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in. I so do appreciate it. I am so thankful for you, the listener, for tuning in every morning, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on the Morning Buzz. Yesterday, the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And for many people, we look at this assassination and the anniversary of this assassination as the day they took our country away from us. This is the day that the powers that be decided that we, the people, should not and could not govern ourselves. Okay, so they couldn't allow us to have a national populist president, and they didn't want him to take the reins and to steer us away from things like war, to steer us away from things like globalism. So I'm going to chat about that here in the 6 o'clock hour. You're listening to the Morning Buzz. So thankful for you. Happy Thanksgiving. Maybe you're driving to grandma's house. Maybe you're driving to the in law's house. Either way, if you're driving, I hope you get there safely. Text in at 309-451-9299. I so appreciate you tuning in every morning. Following the news every day, guys. It's not as easy as it looks. I love doing it. But it's not worth it if you guys don't listen, if you guys don't interact, and you guys listen, and you are the most interactive audience, I think, in Bloomington or in the country. I just love this audience, and I just am so grateful to have you because I can do what I do. I can do what I love every morning and be with you in the car every morning if it wasn't for you listening. So I really appreciate it. And today we've been talking a little bit about the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. I'm going to get into some more of the details. I talked about JFK and how the assassination, really the anniversary of the assassination, is a day that I and you probably look at and we're like, "Yep, that's the day they took our country away from us. This is the day that the powers that be, they decided that we, the people, should not and could not govern ourselves. And they couldn't allow a nationalist populist president to take the reins and to steer us away from things like war, to steer us away from the path of globalism, the path of world domination, but instead institute some real freedom, real elections in our nation. And JFK's assassination, really what it represents, it's big government. When he was assassinated, that was the birth of big government. That was the birth of the deprivation of rights that we are seeing today. And it represents the power of Washington, D.C., the culmination of power by Washington, D.C. over the electorate. So prior to the assassination of JFK, we used to have the United States. Okay, we used to govern ourselves. We used to elect people uh, to represent us and to represent the Constitution. We had a republic, and uh, after the assassination of JFK, that is when we became districts of the regime. We no longer had individual states, uh, and were united as one nation, but rather we became districts of the regime that operates out of Washington, D.C. And before we took the break, I mean, I was telling you a little bit about the Bay of Pigs. This was huge. He had a deep distrust, JFK, of the Central Intelligence Agency and of the intelligence agencies because they misled him on a whole lot. And people don't know this, but the Bay of Pigs was a planned invasion of Cuba, and it was a fiasco because the CIA actually promised JFK that the men storming the beach would have air cover, and that would actually be supplied by 29 Panamanian flag bombers, and that was supposed to be bombers were supposed to be piloted by Cuban pilots, but the CIA, they quietly took that away. They canceled it, and they actually provoked JFK into using the US Air Force to provide that air cover. And what that did was provoke a war with Russia. So he distrusted the CIA because they lied to him. And that wasn't the only thing they lied to JFK about, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, America was completely taken by surprise waking up that morning to learn that the Russians had placed this intercontinental ballistic missiles just 90 miles away from the shore. And he even despite all of that, he could not be goaded into war. He stood for a strong America, JFK did, and he denounced the secret societies. What do you think he was talking about when he denounced the secret society? He was talking about the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, who murdered JFK. So the murder of JFK, absolutely the starting point of the deep state takeover and the American they wanted to take over the American government. They didn't want the people elected to have the authority anymore. They wanted to run things. And by they, I mean these unelected bureaucrats in connection with their cronies and their special interests, particularly the defense industry. And we're seeing it today. So you have two camps, and I'm going to break this down the uniparty and leftist listening. The crystal labels, the AOCs. We don't agree on a whole lot. I have a good friend who is a Bernie Sanders supporter, has a Bernie Sanders bumper sticker, and I think we agree on a whole lot more than uh, me and maybe Ron DeSantis, maybe a rhino of some kind, Nikki Haley, right? Because they're on to something. Those extreme leftists, believe me, I'm not for anything. The socialists, they might have purple hair and a nose ring, and but they are on to something. The people on the right are on to something. We're both screaming fascism, but we just have a different idea of where that fascism is. And they think it's Donald Trump. They think it's Donald Trump, the right wing of the Republican Party. I know that it's not the left wing of the Democrat Party. There are four different parties. There's left wing Democrat Party, the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, and the right wing Republican Party. And I'm going to tell you, the two people who disagree on a whole lot, but they are not fascists. They are pro even the people in the left wing of the Democrat Party, and I get, they scream socialism, but they're onto something because they understand that we are no longer living in a free society. We're no longer living in a free nation. Our elected officials no longer have authority, and they get that, and we get that in the right wing of the Republican Party. This uniparty, there's two camps, okay, and I'm going to try to break this down. You have the Yankee political corridor, and this is sort of the old money of New York. And then you've got the Cowboys. The Cowboys represent Texas and the energy industry, big oil, and they are also sort of tied in with this military industrial complex. So this is why Nikki Haley is so pro war, pro Ukraine conflict, pro. She wants to get into war with Iran. That's why you hear all of this warmongering Republican, because you know one of you've got one side that is more sort of Republican dominated. Those are the Cowboys. That's your Bushes, and then you've got the other side, the Yankees. Those are Democrat dominated. That's the Democrat dominated political corridor, and those are your Clintons. Okay. And those are your finance type Yankees, big banks. And this is really interesting. And, you know, I think we have had some presidents, we've had a few presidents that have fought to try to throw off this yoke, this covenant that the Yankees and the Cowboys have together. We've had a few presidents who tried to uh, change things up a bit. But really, what changed when the cabal took over? We've established now that JFK's assassination, that is when they took over. Now, what really changed when the cabal took over? I think it's the end of civilian controlled government. And we're starting to see this. The uniparty is alive and well. That's why they have Joe Biden. He's a placeholder because the presidency, that's an elected position. And I've already told you that the unelected bureaucrats are the people in charge. They have the authority in connection with their cronies, their special interests, the defense industry, the military industrial complex, big oil, finance, big banks. Okay. So that is who has the authority. They don't care who is in the presidency. And, um, I think that this is the end, and we are living in an era where the civilians do not control government. all the way right down to your local municipal government. Okay. The planning commissions are appointed. Chris Coos, the mayor of Normal, he appoints people to the planning commission, and these are his pals. Okay. So these are the people pulling the strings. The elected positions, they are just faces. And the people pulling the strings are really the people with the authority. Anyway, so one of Kennedy's greatest sins was actually favoring the elimination of oil depletions allowance. So he wanted to eliminate this oil depletion allowance, which would cost Texas oilmen tens of millions of dollars in additional taxes. Okay, so he was anti big oil. Uh, and, I'm not against oil. No, 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 no. I'm anti uh, big oil, Texas oilmen, these unelected bureaucrats, the special interest groups, okay, the cronies. I'm against that. So Kennedy was actually in favor of eliminating the oil depletion allowance. Look that up. And what that was going to do, it was going to cost the Texas oilmen, the cowboys, tens of millions of dollars in additional taxes. So Roger Stone, he's actually put forward this really cool theory, and I've read his book a couple a couple of times. Well, I've read it one time and a half. So I've gotten through it a second time halfway through. But Roger Stone, really cool. And he put forward this theory that RFK was actually right about. So Robert F. Kennedy has said before that the CIA was involved in his uncle's murder. And that's true, according to Roger Stone. But Roger Stone proposes a different similar theory. Not only was it the CIA, but it was organized crime. It was big Texas oil. It was the big banks because the big banks opposed Kennedy's. Uh, Kennedy was so persistent. He wanted to back the dollar with silver, and that is when the big banks were like, whoa, 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 this guy, we don't want this guy. Like I said, Kennedy was in favor of eliminating the oil depletion allowance. So he was anti Yankee and anti cowboy. That's what Kennedy was. He wanted to back our US dollar with silver, which is so smart. And we should. And the reason why we have soaring inflation and why we are in just such a financial mess, it's because we didn't back that dollar with either silver or gold. But the man at the helm, the man with the most to lose, the man who would agree to give Israel nuclear weapons, which John F. Kennedy would not agree to, the man who wanted to go deeper into Vietnam because he and his wife had thousands of shares of Bell helicopter stock. Look this up, General Dynamics stock, defense stocks. That was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And this is where Roger Stone's theory is pretty airtight because Roger proves that not only did Johnson have the motive, he had the means, the opportunity to kill Kennedy. And indeed, he orchestrated it, but he orchestrated it not just on behalf of himself to grab power, because we know LBJ, he became president, which the deep state was very happy with, by the way. But he did it on behalf and in conjunction with the Central Intelligence Agency and organized crime and big Texas and the big banks. Like I said, the Yankees, they're all about the big banks. Then you've got the Cowboys who are all about the big oil and the military industrial complex. And I think it was E. Howard Hunt. He's the infamous CIA operative. And he was one of the Watergate burglars who confessed actually on his deathbed that he had been in Dallas the morning of November 22nd, 1963. So yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. And this was on his deathbed. He says that he was there the morning of the big event, is what he called it. And then he said that it was LBJ who was running the show. So go look it up. It's called themانwhokilledkennedy.com. Get your book there. I've read this book. It's Roger Stone's book. It's incredible. And like I said, I think the 60th anniversary of the assassination is for us a reminder that this is the day that our country was taken away from us. This is the day where the powers that be decided that the people should not and could not govern themselves. And they did not want a nationalist, populist president to take the reins, to steer us away from the path of war, to steer us away from the path of globalism. There's no money when we aren't in war. Okay. Why do you think President Donald Trump, they don't like him? He did not put us and throw us into another war. And they don't like that because they're not getting rich on their Bell helicopter stock. They're not getting rich on their Boeing stock. Uh, we know Nikki Haley sits on the board for Boeing. And, like I said, there's 4 parties. There's not 2 parties. There's 4 parties. And, one place I can agree with the AOC kind of camp of the world and the Bernie Sanders supporter, they realize that it's go time, that this is wartime, that there's fascism, and it's the people in the middle. It's these Republicans and Democrats, these Yankees and Cowboys that you have to be afraid of truly, because they are the uniparty and they're fascists. Okay, so we have to take a quick break. Like I said, I'm live YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Rumble. We are going to talk about the first Thanksgiving. I'm going to open with Rush Limbaugh's true story of Thanksgiving, and then I'm going to get into the first Thanksgiving, and it was nothing like you were taught in grade school. That's next on the Buzz. Good morning, friends. Thanks so much for tuning in to the live stream. We've got so much to talk about, and I'm very excited to bring you the true story of Thanksgiving. Okay, so whether or not we realize it, we all have an image of the first Thanksgiving in our heads. And that's more or less a cartoon that we were taught in grade school in the autumn of 1621. A group of buckle shoed pilgrims and stoic yet friendly Indians feasted together after a successful autumn harvest, heralding 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 a promising new friendship between their two people. So this is the idea that we've got in our heads. The actual history of the first Thanksgiving is, of course, nothing like the grade school story. It's far more interesting, far more complex. We're going to talk about it here on the Buzz. Good morning. I'm so thankful for you. I'm thankful for the listener. I am so grateful that you give me the opportunity to do what I love each and every day. And, I'm so thankful to be your sister in Christ and to talk about very important things. So, in the 6 o'clock hour, we really covered the JFK assassination yesterday, November 22nd. That was the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. And like I told you guys, I think that the assassination of JFK for many people is a time to look at this day as the day they took the country from us. This is the day the powers that be decided that we, the people, should not and could not govern ourselves. And they couldn't allow us to have a national populist president. And I told you about how the CIA and LBJ, they were behind the assassination of JF Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. So before we took the break, I was telling you guys that I was going to tell you about the first Thanksgiving. And, whether or not we want to admit it or realize it, we all have this idea and this image of the first Thanksgiving in our head. And it's more or less a cartoon we were taught in grade school. In the autumn of 1621, a group of buckle shoed pilgrims and friendly Indians, they feasted together after a successful autumn harvest. And this was a chance for them to have a new friendship. And there was a promising new friendship there between their two peoples. The actual history of the first Thanksgiving is actually nothing like the grade school story. It's far more interesting, far more complex, and I'm very excited to chat about the first Thanksgiving. First, I'm going to open with Rush Limbaugh's True Story of Thanksgiving. We've got to kind of do some backgrounds, the story of the Pilgrims and where it begins, because it begins at the early part of the 17th century. And I want to talk about the rule of King James I in England and how the Pilgrims truly came to be. And then, after we get into the history of the Pilgrims, we're going to dive into the first Thanksgiving and the story there. So, come back. We're going to talk about Rush Limbaugh's True Story of Thanksgiving. He did this years ago, and I'm going to bring it to you guys here on the Morning Buzz. So grab the kids. This is their opportunity. Go grab them from the go grab them from their bedrooms. I know they're sleeping in because they're off from school. Go grab them from their bedrooms, put them in the chair, grab your cup of coffee. We're going to sit down, we're going to chat about the first Thanksgiving because there's a lot of revisionist history out there, and I do think that this indoctrination going on in public schools is deliberate. They don't want you to know the true story behind the Pilgrims and the Indians and what happened. So we're going to break it all down here on the Morning Buzz. Happy Thanksgiving. That's next. Yeah, the Rush story is great. So I'm going to open with a little bit of that, and then I'm going to shift gears, and I'm kind of going to bring you my own first Thanksgiving story. I ripped off of a Federalist piece, which I thought was really helpful. And then I kind of made it my own. So I'm excited. Happy Thanksgiving to you, Henry. I appreciate it. May the Lord keep you and yours safe. You too, my friend. Um, and we're going to be back. I've got a lot to talk about. We're going to open. And then we're going to dig into this in the 7 o'clock hour. And then I will revisit, if you're just tuning in, I'm going to revisit the CIA bit where I talk about how the CIA actually killed JFK because yesterday I missed it. The assassination, the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. So we're going to be back in just a couple of minutes. Ooh, are you ready to eat? Are you ready to eat today? How many calories do we eat on Thanksgiving? Well, according to Calorie Control Council, the average American may consume more than 4,500 calories and 229 grams of fat on Thanksgiving Day. So, what would it take to burn off all of those calories? 15 hours of cycling, a 10.3-hour hike, uh, and then a 28-mile run. That's insane. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not much of a I don't, pig out on Thanksgiving. I can't. I get so tired. Yesterday, I guess, was this thing, it's called Drinksgiving. So Drinksgiving is this thing where you do this before Thanksgiving. It's a big day of drinking. In fact, it's the biggest drinking night of the year. So its name, Drinksgiving, hence the name, Drinksgiving. On Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, there's a 167% increase in alcohol sales compared to a typical Wednesday night. So makes sense. I mean, people are home from the college, they're meeting up with old friends, home from college, the college kids, they're going to be drinking with their families, their friends, there's relatives in town, and everyone's feeling festive about having 4 days off. So, yeah, that's Drinksgiving. Did you drink yesterday? I'm not much of a drinker. Well, first of all, it's hard to drink, especially during the week, because you wake up and I gotta be here pretty early. So try drinking even one glass of wine. I'm just like, whoa, I can't get up the next morning. But I guess that a lot of people drank yesterday. Like it used to be called Blackout Wednesday. I guess they changed it and now it's called Drinksgiving. But speaking of drinking, um, there's this new thing. It's drinking a new. It's a green bean casserole. So this is where you drink the green bean casserole instead of actually just eating it. So it's this brand of herbal sparkling water, and it's been concocted and they called it the green bean casserole sparkling water. The calorie-free bubbly beverage is made with natural green bean flavor and sage extract. So you'll have to add your own French onions and cream of mushroom soup, I guess, to it because it just has the green bean flavor and the sage. But this company that makes the green bean casserole sparkling water, they also have honey pumpkin, they have, mango chili, lavender cucumber, and, you can purchase them all, including the new green bean casserole on their website. It's called Area Bora? I don't know, this is a weird website, but, yeah, I will not be purchasing green bean casserole sparkling water. I prefer to eat it, not drink it. Alright, I'm back with the first Thanksgiving story, the true and the real story. I'm gonna open with Rush Limbaugh's true story of Thanksgiving to kinda give you a background of the Pilgrims and how they came to be the Pilgrims, and then we're gonna get into the actual first Thanksgiving, that cartoonish idea in your head. It's not exactly true. So that's next on the buzz. Hey, good morning. Thanks so much for tuning in. I so do appreciate it. This morning, we are going to be talking about the first Thanksgiving. It's very important. On August 1st of 1620, the Mayflower actually set sail and it carried about 102 passengers, including 40 of these separationists, the Pilgrims. There were just 40 of them, okay, and they were led by William Bradford. On the journey across the Atlantic, talk about something very frightening and scary, huh? Um, this Mayflower was not much bigger than a 50-foot boat, and it had 102 people on it. On the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, if you will, that established just and equal laws for all 40 members of the Pilgrim community. Um, and I'm going to be chatting a little bit about their religious beliefs, why they boarded the Mayflower, and this is going to be from Rush Limbaugh's True Story of Thanksgiving. And then we're going to get into the first Thanksgiving and how it's not like it's not anything like we were taught in school. So I'm back. Happy Thanksgiving. Good morning. This is the Morning Buzz. We're doing a little something different here on the Morning Buzz this morning. And, Thanksgiving, uh, we weren't taught the first Thanksgiving correctly in school. That shouldn't come as a shock to you. We were also lied to. The CIA did, in fact, kill John F. Kennedy and LBJ. People try to disparage those claims and they try to say that that's not true. I recommend you going out and getting the book. Roger Stone has it out there. It's the man who killed Kennedy.com. You can go get your book there. I went through the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination. It was yesterday, November 22nd, 1963 is when he died. And I told you that this was the day they took our country away from us. And this is the day that the powers that be decided that the people should not and could not govern themselves. And they couldn't allow us to have a national and populist president. And they did not want John F. Kennedy to steer us away from the path of war, the path of globalism, the path of world domination. John F. Kennedy, what he wanted to do was institute real freedom, real elections in this nation and they didn't like that. So JFK's assassination, we talked about that in the 6 o'clock hour. Now in the 7 o'clock hour, I want to start with Rush Limbaugh's True Story of Thanksgiving. I'm going to open with this in the 7 o'clock hour. We're going to then shift gears and we're going to talk about the first Thanksgiving and how it wasn't taught anything like this in school. But I want to start with Rush Limbaugh's True Story of Thanksgiving because it's the story of the Pilgrims and how the Pilgrims came to be. And I think that's important context in order to understand what happened on the first day or the first Thanksgiving day. So the story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century. The Church of England, under King James I, he was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize the church's absolute civil and spiritual authority. So he was persecuting people, he was persecuting the pilgrims. Those who challenged the authority and those who believed strongly in the freedom of worship, they were hunted down. This was in England in the 1600s. They were hunted down and they were imprisoned, and sometimes they were even executed for their beliefs. Okay, so a group of separationists, separatists, they they didn't want any part of this. So they fled to Holland first. They fled to Holland where they made wooden shoes and they ate cheese and they they established a little community. They stayed there for about 11 years. After 11 years, about 40 of these separatists, these separationists who liked wooden shoes and cheese, they agreed to make this perilous journey to the New World. Um, they had heard about it. They heard that it was this new, exciting place that hadn't yet been developed, and they knew that they were going to face hardships like you and I could never know. We just don't know. We couldn't possibly imagine the hardship that these people endured. We can't. We're way too advanced now. People who lived in the 1600s would not believe life today. They just wouldn't. I mean, try to explain flight and jet travel to they just wouldn't understand it. So they knew they'd face hardships, but of paramount importance to them was living freely and worshiping God according to the dictates of their own consciences and their own belief systems. Okay, they wanted to worship God freely and not according to the authority, the spiritual authority that was in the England that was in England in the 1600s. So they were denied freedom of worship, freedom to worship God in England in the 1600s. So that brings us to August 1st of 1620. That is when the Mayflower set sail. It carried a total of 102 passengers, including 40 of these separatists from Holland, the Pilgrims. There was just 40 of them, 40 pilgrims, and they were led by a man. His name was William Bradford. And the journey across the Atlantic, talk about something very frightening and scary. On the journey across the Atlantic, they boarded a boat. It was called the Mayflower, and it wasn't much bigger than, a 50-foot boat, had 102 people on it. On the journey, this man, William Bradford, set up an agreement, a contract, if you will, and it established some equal laws for the 40 members of the Pilgrim community. And it didn't matter what their religious beliefs were, it was just equal laws for the 40 members of the Pilgrim community, and it was a contract, an agreement, if you will. And these are laws they were all agreeing to live by. So once they got there, they lived by these rules. And I mean, where did these revolutionary ideas, these laws come from? So if you read through the Mayflower Compact, that's the contract that I'm talking about. Um, that's what Bradford wrote. The Mayflower Compact was actually derived from the Bible. You see, the Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old and New Testament. They were devoutly religious people. They never doubted they would get to the New World. They never doubted that once they got there, they would thrive. God was on their side. Duh. The journey was long and it was dangerous. And when they finally landed, the Pilgrims finally landed in New England in November. Now, according to William Bradford's detailed journal, they found a cold, barren, desolate wilderness. Okay, so they were in a wilderness. So now imagine, if you will, New England as it exists today, but it's not there's no buildings, there's no houses, it's just rocks, forests, and underdeveloped nature in November, and it's getting colder and colder and colder. They had no friends to greet them. There was no shelter of any kind, uh, other than hiding under a tree, of course, but there was nothing, folks. There was absolutely nothing. There were no hotels, there were no inns, there was no places to clean up, there was no houses, and this was real hardship. The sacrifice they made for freedom to worship was just the beginning. Okay, so during that first winter, remember, they arrive in November. So during that first winter, half of them, including William Bradford, uh, Bradford's own wife, they actually all died of starvation, sickness, exposure to the elements. Okay, so half of them died because of sickness, exposure. Now we're getting close to what you were taught in school. Okay, so whether or not we realize it, we have this image of the first Thanksgiving, and that's more or less a cartoon that we were taught in grade school. So in the beginning here of this segment, I read to you just Rush Limbaugh's true story of Thanksgiving. That was the background story of the Pilgrims, how they got to the New World. Okay, that's very important context. Now we're going to shift gears. We're going to talk about the first Thanksgiving. So stick with me. Now you've got this cartoon image in your head, and it's the autumn of 1621. A group of buckle-shoed pilgrims and stoic yet friendly Indians feasted together after a successful autumn harvest, and they've got this new friendship between their two peoples. Okay, this is the cartoon that is in your head from grade school. How do I know it's in your head? Because it's in my head, and that's what I was taught in school. The actual history of the first Thanksgiving, of course, is much more complex, much more interesting, and it's nothing like the grade school story. So we're going to get into it here. While the story is going to undermine this multicultural narrative of peaceful Indians and these well-meaning pilgrims living together in harmony. It informs a it it also informs a radically more nuanced understanding of the world the Pilgrims found when they landed in Plymouth in December of 1620. So I talked about the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth in December of 1620. They half of them died because they got sick. They were exposed to elements. This is not this like kumbaya multicultural narrative that the leftists want to push on you, and they definitely don't want you to know that the Indians weren't peaceful. They were not a peaceful people, and we're going to get into the historical account of people. And the best book that I've seen out there about the first Thanksgiving comes from a man. His name is Charles Mann, and this is a 2005 book. It's called 1491, A Revisionist History of Pre-Columbian Americas, and it really makes my idea of the first Thanksgiving really boring. But this was a really cool book. I recommend you check this out. It's this 2005 book by Charles Mann. I'm going to be reading from bits of the book when we get into the story of the first Thanksgiving. But like I said, this is the story that I'm about to give you is going to blow holes in this multicultural narrative. It's going to blow holes in this idea that the Indians were peaceful and that the Puritans or the Pilgrims were well meaning and that they were all going to live in harmony. It blows holes in all of it. And uh, I'm going to be reading parts of this book to you this morning, but I'm also going to give you my own flavor of the Thanksgiving story. So here we go. The Pilgrims, they were able to survive and establish a colony because they were drawn into the political schemes of Massasoit. He was a shrewd and calculating Indian leader who was trying to figure out how to save his own people from apocalypse because Massasoit, he was a political and military leader of this Indian tribe. It was called the Wampanoag. And it's the Wampanoag Confederation. This is a loose combination of villages in southern eastern Massachusetts. And about 5 years before the Pilgrims arrived, Massasoit's people, now this is the military leader, his people were decimated by disease brought on by earlier European traders, and entire villages had been depopulated, including a little village. It was called Patuxet. And the newly arrived pilgrims settled into this Patuxet village, and they named it New Plymouth. Okay, so the pilgrims, they settled. I told you about their journey on the Mayflower, and they settled into this little place. It was called Plymouth, New Plymouth. Okay, and that used to be a village. It was called Patuxet, and it was so depopulated that there were no Indians there anymore from the Wampanoag tribe, the Confederation. It was a loose combination of all of these southern eastern Massachusetts uh, villages, and that was his little tribe, the Wampanoags. Okay, so Massasoit uh, was in a bind here. He was in a bind because a lot of his people were dead. The epidemic that had hit the Wampanoags hadn't touched their longtime enemies to the west. Now, these were the Naranjaset. Now, forgive me on the pronunciations. I tried my best, but they're the Naranjasets. So those were their enemies to the west. To the west, they did not like the Wampanoags. So these are two kind of like Indian tribes. So Massasoit, he feared his weakened people. Like I told you, his people were sick. A lot of them were wiped out. This was a collection of southern eastern Massachusetts villages, and he was worried that this enemy to the west, the Indian tribe, was going to overrun, and he actually decided to let the Pilgrims stay. Now, the Massasoits tribe, they might have killed these Pilgrims when they first settled in New Plymouth here, but he didn't because he had political gain. He was going to have political gain by the Pilgrims staying, and I'll get into that here. But the European traders had been visiting from New England for at least a century at this point. So there were all kinds of early on European traders that would come over to the New World. This is how the Pilgrims heard about it. Okay, the Pilgrims were not the first people to come. There were plenty of European traders that would come to visit New England for at least a century before the Pilgrims actually made this journey on the Mayflower and settled there. But the Indian leaders always forbid them to establish permanent settlements. The English or the Indian leaders, they would kill. They'd kill all of the European traders. They tried to go and kill them. They forbid them establishing permanent settlements. But there was a relationship here that was strictly transactional. Okay. Far from seeing the Europeans as superior, the Indians had good reason to take advantage of these strange newcomers, the Pilgrims, because at this point, Massasoit, like I said, he's fearing that his weakened people were going to be overrun by the enemies to the west of him. And he was like, fine, I'm going to let these pale white foreigners, these shorter than the Indians. They were much shorter. They were oddly dressed. They were dirty. They were pale. They had blue eyes that were peculiar to the Indians. And they had this, straw like hair that just encased their faces. So they did not think that these newcomers were superior. They actually thought that they were super irritatingly talkative, and surprisingly incompetent. I mean, the Indians just believed that they were incompetent, and they thought that they couldn't do basic tasks that the Indians could do. But here's what the Pilgrims offered. They offered beautiful goods like copper kettles, glittering colored glass, steel knives, hatchets, unlike anything else in New England. So the Indians were not a developed people. They would exchange valuable items for cheap furs. So the Indians would give the Pilgrims cheap furs and blankets and things like that that they had. And for a comparison, this is like going into the mall, say a dingy little kiosk, okay? And you'd swap your dirty socks, your used socks for electronics for the new iPhone. Okay, that's essentially what this was. The Indians would go up and give them used socks, and then the Pilgrims were like, "Yay, used socks! Here is the new iPhone." So that's a comparison here, but almost anyone would be willing to overlook the Pilgrims' peculiar faces, their blue eyes, their straw-like hair. They were willing to overlook that because there was a transactional agreement between the two. You give us what we want, and we are going to be wiped out. Uh, and we need this stuff. We need this stuff in order to build up this colony of Indians. Because I'm afraid Massasoit, the military leader, the political leader, he was afraid that the people to the west, the Indian people to the west of him, were going to overrun his little Indian tribe. So they would exchange the goods. Massasoit's plan to allow the Pilgrims to stay as long as was to allow the Pilgrims to stay. That was his plan all along, as long as they allied with the Wampanoag. That's his little Indian tribe, Massasoit's tribe. He was going to allow those Pilgrims to stay if they allied with them against the enemies to the west. That's the Narragansett. I botched that pronunciation, but Narragansett, the enemies to the west. So he says, Pilgrims, you can stay if you ally with us against this enemy to the west. So his first meeting with them, however, ended in a battle, okay, with the Pilgrims. So Massasoit, he arranged a meeting, and we're going to get into that here on the other side. I want to talk about that meeting uh, because, this is where the grade school version of what we were told totally gets debunked. They were not peaceful Indians. And I'm going to talk about Massasoit and how he sent these two interpreters into this pilgrim settlement on November 22nd, 1621. he sent these two interpreters. This was the first meeting between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims. And I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about a guy named Squanto. This is where Squanto comes in. You might recognize that name. That's next on the buzz. They did not have guns. I'm going to get to that. This meeting is really interesting. They had knives, they had copper kettles, they had wheels. They brought a really I mean, innovation and technology. So, like I said, the Indians had like these fur rugs, and like it'd be similar to trading out your used socks at some sort of kiosk for the new iPhone. So I want to make it clear that the Pilgrims actually had something of value for Massasoit, who was this Indian political leader. He was a military leader, and he actually knew the Pilgrims had something of value to him at the time. And politically, he was worried about his own tribe, the Wampanoags, because he was afraid that they were going to be wiped out totally by the enemies to the west of him. So he had something politically to gain here. Now, they were not a peaceful people, and we're going to get into all of that. But uh, all the Indians were peaceful and they loved each other. That's not true. And really, the grade school idea of this Thanksgiving, of the first Thanksgiving, is indoctrination. Once we get into this meeting, and if we talk about the Indians, they were actually the bad guys in this story. The real Thanksgiving story, it proves that the Indians were the bad guys. Now, eventually, the bad guys and the good guys, they did sit down with a feast, but it's way more complex than that and interesting than them breaking bread together. So we're going to talk about it here on the Morning Buzz. Going to grab a quick drink, and then we're going to chat about the Thanksgiving story, the Pilgrims and the Indians in the 7 o'clock hour here. So don't go anywhere. In the 8 o'clock hour, you guys will want to stick around because I will probably revisit the CIA killing JFK along with Lyndon B. Johnson. I think he's the man behind it all. He was the lead operative in this big event, the killing of JFK. And that was the anniversary was yesterday, November 22nd, when JFK was killed. So keep it right here. We'll be right back. Happy Thanksgiving. I appreciate you as a listener. I'm so glad to have you in my life, and I'm so grateful that I get to get behind the microphone every morning, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. This is the Morning Buzz. I'm Kat Peterson. Now, we were talking a little bit about Massasoit's plan and how he allowed the Pilgrims to stay as long as they would be allied with the Wampanoags against the enemy to the west. There was this Western Indian tribe, and he was worried that they were going to overrun the Wampanoag tribe because the Wampanoag tribe was depleted. They were wiped out by diseases, by exposure to the elements, and Massasoit, he was calculated. He was a political leader, he was a military leader, and he was going to allow the Pilgrims to stay because this was a transactional relationship. This morning, I'm talking about the first Thanksgiving. I opened the 7 o'clock hour with Rush Limbaugh's true story of Thanksgiving, and I took a little bit of his background information. Um, this was great. He did it years ago. It was the true story of Thanksgiving, and it was the story of the Pilgrims. And it began in the early part of the 17th century, where the Church of England, under King James I, he was persecuting everybody because they would not recognize the church's absolute and civil spiritual authority. So they would be hunted down. They would be hunted down, imprisoned, and sometimes executed for their beliefs. And there was this little group of separatists, and they didn't want any part of this. So they actually fled to Holland first, and then they established a little community, and then they were there for about 11 years. And after 11 years, they heard about this new exciting place, the New World. It hadn't been developed yet. And they knew they were going to face hardships like you and I would never even know. Because, I mean, these were hardships that people endured. And we're so advanced, we can't even wrap our heads around what they had to go through. And I am so thankful I did not have to go through that. And ancestors, English ancestors, the Pilgrims went through that, and we can point to this little bit of history today and say thank you for being a political dissenter. Really, I mean, they said enough. We want to have freedom. We want to freely worship God the way we want to, and they faced all of these hardships. But what was of the paramount of importance? What was of paramount importance to them was living freely and worshiping God. Um, and having their own beliefs. And we couldn't even imagine what they went through when they boarded that Mayflower in August of 1620. August 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail, total of 102 passengers. Of the 102, there was about 40 of them, pilgrims. They were led by a guy named William Bradford. They took the journey across the Atlantic, and talk about something frightening and scary, taking a journey across the Atlantic on a boat that was about 50 feet long. It was a kind of a small boat for 102 people to be on it, but uh, of the 102 people, there were 40 members, pilgrims, and William Bradford, he actually set up this contract, which we know as today the Mayflower Compact. Now, this was a a a group of, or this was a set of rules. This was rules established, and they were just and equal laws for all 40 members of the Pilgrims. Hey, once we get there, we're going to follow these laws. Now, what was the Mayflower Compact derived from? The Bible. The Pilgrims, they were completely steeped in the lessons of Old Testament, New Testament. They were devoutly religious people. They were good people, and they never doubted that they were going to get to that new world. They never doubted for a second because they had God on their side. They knew that they were going to thrive. Now, when they did get there, it was cold. It was just wilderness. It was rocks. And just imagine, you know, New England today as it exists today, but there's no houses, no nothing, and it just is getting colder and colder, and there's no place for shelter, maybe hiding under a tree, no hotels, and that's the sacrifice they made to have the freedom to worship, and they were wiped out, including William Bradford's own wife. A lot of them died. About half of them died from sickness, exposure to the elements. Now we're close to what we were taught in school. Okay, so now you've got the background of the Pilgrims. Now we're close to what we were taught in school the first Thanksgiving. The the buckled shoed pilgrims. They were breaking bread with the friendly Indians, and the Indians helped them, and they feasted together after a successful autumn harvest. And that's just not true. It's not anything like that. The school story that we were told, it totally, this story is improper, and it's not this multicultural narrative where peaceful Indians got together with the well-meaning pilgrims and they lived together in harmony. No, 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 no. That is not at all what happened. And I was telling you guys little bit about Massasoit before we took the break. He was a political and military leader of this Indian tribe called the Wampanoags. This is the Wampanoag Confederation. They were a loose combination of villages in southern eastern Massachusetts. Now, there was this little village called Patuxet. It was a little village, but it was pretty much wiped out from diseases. Massasoit's people had been kind of disseminated by diseases brought in by earlier traders, earlier European traders. Okay, so there were people there before Europeans that were there before the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were just the first to settle because the Indians never allowed, the Indian leaders always forbid, would always forbid the European settle or the European traders to settle. They never wanted them to establish permanent settlements. This was the first time where Massasoit gave them allowed them. He didn't kill them because that's what happened. The Indians would kill European traders if they tried to settle um, on the land. But this was the first time where the Indians actually allowed the European traders to settle, or these European people to settle, uh, because there was a transactional relationship that he wanted. He was a political leader, he was calculating, he was a military leader, and what he was truly worried about was his enemies to the west. I told you the makeup of his little Wampanoags. They were disseminated. It was like a ragtag group of villages, and Pawtucket, this little village, was pretty much wiped out. And he allowed the Pilgrims to arrive there and to settle there, and they named it New Plymouth. The Pilgrims did. He was worried about the Indian tribe to the west of them. He feared that his weakened people would be overrun, so he gambled and he let the Pilgrims stay in New Plymouth. And uh, he did not see the Europeans as superior. In fact, he thought they were dumb. He thought that they were pale and dirty, and he did not like their eyes. A lot of Indians did not like them. Um, and they didn't like the fact that they were irritatingly talkative. That's one thing that the Europeans were, or that these pilgrims were. They were talkative, but they produced these beautiful goods. They produced copper kettles. They had these steel knives. They had hatchets. They didn't have guns, but I'm going to get to that here in just a second. And this is unlike anything else that they've ever seen. These Massasoit people, the Wampanoags, they hadn't seen anything like this in New England up to this point. So they allowed them to stay because they knew that they were very close to extinction because their enemy to the west was going to possibly overrun them. So Massasoit's plan was to allow the Pilgrims to stay if and as long as they allied with the Wampanoags against the enemy to the west if the time came. So there was a meeting that Massasoit actually arranged, and this was their first meeting with the Pilgrims. Massasoit, he sent two interpreters to the Pilgrim settlement on November 22nd, 1621. And the first man, he was named Samoset. That was his name, and he was a very trusted ally of Massasoit. So Massasoit, military leader, calculating, cunning, he trusted Samoset. Now, there was a second interpreter that he sent over to go talk with the Pilgrims at their settlement, and that was Squanto. Tisquantum is his full name, but he's better known as Squanto. And he was not trusted by Massasoit. He was not trusted by him at all. So Squanto, is, of course, that friendly Indian from our grade school textbooks who teaches the Pilgrims how to plant corn and fertilize the crops and fish. Fertilize crops with fish, okay? So this is the friendly Indian Squanto. The truth about Squanto, he was a member of the Patuxet tribe. Remember the tribe, the village that was completely wiped out? Tribe of the Wampanoag Confederation. So this Wampanoag Confederation was much bigger, and Patuxet, as I described to you, was pretty much wiped out by disease. Now, he was a part of that Patuxet tribe of the Wampanoag. Now, he encountered the Pilgrims after a long and harrowing journey of his own, Squanto. So we got to know a little bit about Squanto before we can really understand this first meeting. So 7 years before that first Thanksgiving, 7 years before the first Thanksgiving, Squanto, he was actually captured by British soldiers and sold into slavery in Spain, okay, where he eventually was freed by some local Catholic priests, um, and he made his way to London where he learned English. There, he kind of served as a living conversation piece at a rich man's house. So he wasn't quite a slave after he was freed by these Roman Catholic priests, but he did live in a rich man's house and he served as like this conversation piece. But he was sold into slavery by British sailors and sold into slavery into Spain. And then eventually he was freed. So he's kind of got a bit of a background, Squanto. Okay. So he eventually arranged for passage back to North America. Uh, but when he finally arrived back to Massachusetts, about a year and a half before Massasoit's meeting with the Pilgrims, so this is a year and a half before this first meeting, um, he he found the entire tribe to be wiped out by disease. Patuxet to the village, right? I told you that's been wiped out, and now the Pilgrims have settled there, and they called it New Plymouth. Okay, so you can imagine Squanto as a very angry man. He was sold into slavery, sad, very sad by these British soldiers. And then he was ultimately freed by some white people, Roman Catholic priests, and he made his way to London. That's where he learned English, and that's why he was selected as an interpreter by Massasoit to go to this meeting with the Pilgrims. Okay, so Mann describes Charles Mann, and I talked about his book. It's called 1491. Check it out. He describes Squanto's former home along with the New England coast, along the New England coast here. So Patuxet, that's the village he's from. He describes it as uh, a cemetery 200 miles long and 40 miles deep. So that's really sad. Squanto, he goes to Patuxet. It had been hit with a special force. Not a single person remained in Patuxet. All of his friends dead. Squanto's entire social world just vanished, which is really sad. Um, with nowhere left to go, Squanto presented himself to Massasoit, but the Indian leader did not trust him. And he had kept Squanto in captivity since his arrival, monitoring his actions closely, and wouldn't let him negotiate with the Europeans on his own. I do have to take a break, but we're going to get into the first meeting at Plymouth, I promise. So far, we've talked about the interpreters. One of these interpreters, Squanto, he was not trusted by Massasoit. Okay, he was not trusted by that Indian leader. He's there trying to negotiate with the Pilgrims. He sends these two interpreters to go negotiate with the Pilgrims to inform them, hey, in order for you to stay settled, we are going to need you to ally with us against the enemies to the west of us. And that was his whole thing. So we're going to be back. I'm going through the first Thanksgiving because it's nothing like we were taught in our history books. It's nothing like we were taught in grade school. It's not this multicultural narrative where they were all friends. And the Indians were definitely not peaceful. Okay. They were constantly thinking about war with this Western Indian tribe the whole time they were working with the Pilgrims. And this first meeting is going to blow your mind, folks. So don't go anywhere. We're back uncovering the truth about Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. Yes, I'm so grateful for you, the listener, for tuning in every morning, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. I'm so grateful because without you, there would be no way for me to do what I love day in, day out, and to do what I do for Christ and for God's purpose in my life. I mean, I'm living out God's purpose for me, and I'm so grateful that you, the listener, tunes in. Now, I opened with Rush Limbaugh's True Story of Thanksgiving, and then I've gotten into the first Thanksgiving and how it was like it's nothing like what we were taught in school. And in order to truly understand it, you really have to go all the way back to the Pilgrims and how they began. So the story of the Pilgrims began in the early part of the 17th century. The Church of England was under rule of the King James I, and he was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize the church as absolute civil and spiritual authority. So people were actually hunted down. They were executed. They were imprisoned for their beliefs. And this group of separatists, they didn't want any kind of part in this, and they fled. They fled to Holland and they lived there. They liked wooden shoes and they ate cheese. And they established a cute little community for about 11 years. And after 11 years, about 40 or so separatists who liked these wooden shoes and this in the cheese, they decided to make the perilous journey to the New World. And they knew it was this new, exciting place. And they had heard about it, and they knew it was going to be tough. They knew that they'd face hardships, and hardships like you and I do not understand, could not even comprehend. I mean, imagine trying to tell somebody from the 1600s about life today, try to explain flights or try to explain jet travel. They just wouldn't understand it. So these people, they really endured a lot of pain, suffering. They sacrificed a lot, and they sacrificed a lot because of paramount importance to these people. Living freely and worshiping God, God Almighty, was their biggest thing. They wanted to do this according to their own consciences and to their own beliefs. They wanted to do this, and they were denied that freedom in England. So, August 1st, 1620, they set sail on the Mayflower. And about 40 of the 102 passengers were pilgrims, and they were led by a man named William Bradford. And William Bradford, he created a little document. It was an agreement. It was laws, and they established laws, equal and just laws, for the 40 members of the Pilgrim community. They're like, okay, where did these laws derive from? Where did they come from? Well, the Mayflower Compact, that's what this contract was, it was derived from the Bible. So the Pilgrims were people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old Testament, the New Testament, and they were a devoutly religious people. And they never doubted that they were going to get to the New World. They never doubted that once they got there, they'd thrive because they got God on their side, right? So they got there, and half of them were wiped out from diseases and from exposure to the elements. And William Bradford's own wife died during this cold, cold winter, during that first winter in November. And um, in the autumn of 1621, there was this feast, and it's not the story that we were told in grade school. It wasn't these friendly Indians and these uh, well-meaning pilgrims that got together and they had this new friendship between their two peoples. That's just not true. So I've been going through the story this morning of breaking down what happened on Thanksgiving Day, the first Thanksgiving. And it goes against this multicultural narrative that there were peaceful Indians and well-meaning pilgrims living together in harmony. That's just not true. So I do have to take a break. We're going to get into more of it here in the 8 o'clock hour. I have to take a break. Gotta get to our sponsors, who I'm so grateful to this morning. But before we took the break, last segment, I was telling you a little bit about Massasoit and how he planned out this meeting, and he sent two interpreters to go meet with the pilgrims. That was Samoset and Squanto. And we're going to get to this first meeting that took place at Plymouth, and it almost ended in bloodshed. So I'm excited. We're going to unpack it here on the Buzz. That's Cities 92.9. Yeah, so good morning, folks. If you're watching, go ahead and smash the like button. I'm so appreciative that you are here this morning. I am going to get into more of this Thanksgiving story, and then in the 8 o'clock hour, we will revisit JFK's assassination, which yesterday marked the 60th anniversary of his assassination. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. I am going to get through the rest of this story. You guys won't want to miss it. We have gotten to this point on the November day at Plymouth. This first meeting at Plymouth almost ended in bloodshed. So Massasoit, this military leader, this Indian political calculating leader, he sent these two interpreters ahead while he and the rest of his Indian party kept out of sight. Shh, 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 keep out of sight. And then there was this very tense encounter that could have abruptly ended the Pilgrims' mission of settling in the New World there. So we're going to chat about it here on the Morning Buzz. We're going through the true history of Thanksgiving because it's not what you were taught in grade school. And that, of course, is by design. That's next. Good morning. I'm going to wait about 30 seconds to continue the story for our radio friends as well. So I'll get to a couple of your comments here. Bob, he says they practiced socialism and starved the first winter. Yes, you're talking, of course, about the Indians. Each person believed they were equal to share the collective food if they worked for it or not. So Bradford, William Bradford, the Pilgrim, who made this journey and made the Mayflower Compact. This is a contract that was derived from biblical teachings. Bradford decided each could work for themselves and keep the products of their labor. This is why the village prospered. Now, I'm not going to say prospered. The Pilgrims, half of them were wiped out. However, all of the other tribes, the Indian tribes, they were all uh, totally decimated. Okay, they were wiped out. Pawtucket was one of these villages that was totally just awful. Um, and it was just this grave that Charles Mann actually described as 200 miles long and 40 miles deep, something like that, in his book. So it was totally decimated, obsolete. It no longer existed because the Indians were socialists. They were socialists. They believed in this collectivism idea, and ultimately that destroyed them. Now, Bradford, he believed in God and the biblical teachings, and really the Bible is pro-capitalism. And that's just they just followed the word. Good morning. This is the Morning Buzz. I'm Kat Peterson. Happy Thanksgiving to you and to your family. And I am praying for you this morning. And I'm so grateful that the country that we live in today is because it's really because the pilgrims. This is why we don't have a state religion here in America. Because as I was telling you this morning, and I was going through Rush Limbaugh's The True Story of Thanksgiving, as I was telling you this morning, they fled religious persecution under King James the First. So King James the First, he was going around killing everyone, persecuting anyone who did not recognize the church's absolute civil and spiritual authority. There were these separatists, and they said, you know what? No, we're done being hunted down. We're done being imprisoned. We're done being executed for our beliefs. They fled to Holland first. They stayed there for about 11 years, and eventually, they all agreed to make this perilous journey after 11 years of staying in Holland to the New World. They heard about it. They thought it was this new, exciting place that hadn't been developed yet. And they knew that they were going to face hardships, and they did. They faced a lot of hardships, folks. And then ultimately, they boarded the Mayflower August 1st, 1620, and it carried about 102 passengers. And of those 102 passengers, 40 of them were these separatists, these pilgrims. And they were led by a man named William Bradford. William Bradford, he created the Mayflower Compact. This was an agreement. This was a piece of paper that established just and equal laws. And it was for the pilgrim community. And what was this derived from? The Mayflower Compact was actually derived from the Bible. The Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old Testament, the New Testament. They were devoutly religious people, and they never doubted that once they got to the New World, they were going to be okay. They knew they were going to thrive, and they did. I mean, they did deal with starvation. Bradford's wife died. Sickness, exposure. About half of them were wiped out. Somebody on the text line 309-451-9299, they brought up a great point. I told you about how the Indians were completely decimated. This little village called Patuxet completely wiped out. It was, I mean, all of these Indians were dead. And the reason why is because they were socialists. They believed in this idea of collective food, and you could eat whatever you wanted, and you didn't have to work for it. William Bradford, this guy, he created the Mayflower Compact, and this was rules. This was rules based off of the Bible, derived from the Bible. And the Bible is so pro capitalism, it's not even funny. So the Pilgrims actually made it through that first winter, and a lot of Indians did not. Now, Massasoit, Massasoit is this Indian military leader, and we're close now to the actual history of the first Thanksgiving. So they get there, they get through the first winter, and then there's this autumn of 1621. Okay, and we have this image in our heads, like it or not, or realize it or not, that there were these buckle-shoed pilgrims and these friendly Indians, and they feasted together, and they had this new friendship between the two peoples. This is a multicultural narrative that is bunk. It's stupid. And we're debunking it here on the Morning Buzz because there's actual history. The Pilgrims, they were able to survive and establish their colony. And they were drawn into this political scene of Massasoit. Massasoit was this shrewd, calculating Indian leader, and he wanted to save his people from literal apocalypse. Like I said, the Indian people, because of their collectivism, they almost were gone, like they were wiped out. And like I said, the Patuxet village was completely depopulated. Now, there was this group, it was called the Wampanoag, and it was the Wampanoag Federation. It was a loose combination of villages in the southern eastern Massachusetts area there, and they've been there about 5 years before the Pilgrims arrived. Massasoit's people, a lot of them, like I said, were decimated by disease. They weren't really successful in keeping afloat, keeping themselves alive, the Indian people. Now, Massasoit, he had some enemies to the west that he knew about once the Pilgrims arrived there. Massasoit was worried about the Indian tribe to the west of him, and he feared that his weakened people would be overrun, and he gambled and he actually let the Pilgrims stay. Prior to that, there were all kinds of European traders and people coming to New England for at least a century before. The Indian leaders would always forbid them from actually settling or making permanent settlements. This relationship with the Pilgrims in the Massasoit uh, Wampanoag tribe was strictly transactional. Okay, they actually offered something. These oddly dressed, pale, dirty foreigners. This is just according to historical uh, writings. They did not like the Pilgrims, the Indians. They did not think that the Europeans were superior. Okay, they were actually irritated with how much they talked. They thought that they were irritating. And the Pilgrims, they built these beautiful things like copper kettles, steel knives, hatchets. And to kind of put it into perspective, if you were to go to the mall today, go to a kiosk and give them some old socks, some used socks, and they gave you an iPhone, that's what was going on. There was a transactional thing going on with the Pilgrims where the Indians would give them furs and blankets, and the Pilgrims would give them hatchets, steel knives. I mean, and to really put it into perspective, it's like giving somebody a pair of old socks, and in turn, they give you the new iPhone. Okay, so they were willing to look past. I mean, think about it. If you were getting this, I mean, this deal, you were willing to look past their animal, their straw-like hair, their blue eyes, their short stature. They were short in comparison to the Indians. But Massasoit's plan was to allow the Pilgrims to stay as long as they allied with them, the Wampanoags, against the enemies to the west that he's so worried about. So he decided to meet with them. Now, there's this first meeting, and Massasoit, he sends these two interpreters. We talked about Squanto. Squanto is not this friendly Indian from our grade school textbooks where he teaches the Pilgrims how to plant corn and fertilize their crops with fish. That's not true. The truth about Squanto um, is actually much more disturbing. He has quite the background. He was sold into slavery 7 years before the first Thanksgiving. So this was prior to the Pilgrims settling there. Okay. Uh, he was a member of the Patuxet tribe. I told you that the Patuxet tribe was wiped out during this period where he was gone. So he was captured by British sailors. He was sold into slavery in Spain. Then eventually he was freed by some Catholics. Catholic priest, and then he made his way to London where he learned English, and then he actually served as a kind of living conversation piece at this rich man's house. He wasn't a slave anymore, but he was kind of like living at this rich guy's house as a conversation piece. Eventually, Squanto, he arranged a deal where it came back to North America, and then when he arrived, of course, Pawtucket was Tuxet was it was wiped out. His whole social life, world, it all vanished. It was a cemetery 200 miles long, 40 miles deep. That's what this was. And he was a deeply disturbed individual, Squanto was. And he was not trusted by Missouriot. So Missouriot sent these two interpreters. One of them was Squanto, the other one was Simoset. And he trusted Simoset, but he did not trust Squanto. So Squanto, he presented himself, with when he realized Patuxet was not there anymore. He actually presented himself to Massasoit, and the Indian leader did not trust him. So he kind of kept Squanto in captivity since his arrival and monitored his actions very closely and wouldn't let him go negotiate with Europeans alone. That's why there were two interpreters at this first meeting. So let's talk about the first meeting because this is really Thanksgiving. So on this November day, Plymouth. This is New Plymouth, Patuxet. It was renamed by the Pilgrims. It was called Plymouth. Massoyot sent over the interpreter that he trusts, Samoset, and then Squanto ahead while he and the rest of the Indian party kept out of sight. So Massoyot had a bunch of Indian tribe, Indian. He had the rest of his Indian tribe there, and he kept out of sight. So what followed was a very tense encounter. Okay, that could have abruptly ended the Pilgrims' mission of settling in this new world. Okay, the Pilgrims were almost dead. So Samoset and Squanto, they spoke with the colonists, they spoke with the Pilgrims for about an hour. And I don't know, historical text is a little fuzzy on this, but they could have given a signal, Squanto and Somerset, or perhaps Mississauga. He actually had this prearranged schedule where they ultimately went in any case. He and the rest of the Indian party appeared out of nowhere without any warning at the crest of a hill on the south bank of the creek where they met, where the interpreters met with some pilgrims. And they ran through the foreigners' camp alarmed by Massasoit's sudden entrance. The Europeans, the Pilgrims, they withdrew to the hill on the opposite bank, and there they actually had a few cannons, uh, along with a half-finished stockade, and a standoff ensued. So they almost lost this battle. Okay, this was a surprise attack. They did not know that this was going to happen. So they had this standoff. It ended when Edward Winslow, who would later serve as the governor of the Plymouth colony there. He also was a co-author of an account of the first Thanksgiving. So this is from him. The story I'm giving you today. He would later become the governor of Plymouth colony. His name was Edward Winslow. He waded into the creek wearing a full suit of armor and carrying a sword. And through Squanto, he offered himself as hostage. So he goes, Squanto, take me as hostage. Let's just stop this battle. Let's just stop this standoff. And Squanto took him to Massoyot, and Massoyot accepted, along with Squanto and 20 of his other men. They crossed over, 20 other Indian men. They crossed over the creek into the Pilgrim settlement. So, thus the historic meeting, and later, after a negotiations and an alliance agreement, the Great Thanksgiving Feast. Yet the schemes continued after that. So after this battle ensues, the standoff happens. Squanto, he's approached by this guy, Edward Winslow, and he says, "Take me as hostage. Take me as hostage." And Mrs. Soyot, the political leader, said, "Okay." And eventually, he and Squanto and everybody they went over to the Pilgrim settlement, and then they had this historic meeting. And after the negotiations, there was this Thanksgiving feast, this alliance agreement. No, the schemes continued thereafter. Okay, so Squanto had plans to reestablish the remaining Patuxet, um, in convincing the other Wampanoags that he would make a better leader than Massasoit. Okay, so Squanto actually had some beef with Massasoit. He was, like I said, Squanto had this really screwed up background. Okay, so he is angry. He wants Patuxet to be revitalized by him. He thinks that he'd make a better leader. To do this, he tried to play games with the Pilgrims and Massasoit, actually, and he tried to pit them against each other. Now, there was this alliance in place, this alliance agreement. There were negotiations made after a full blown battle. Um, now, Squanto, he goes back and he tries to stir the pot here between the Pilgrims and Massasoit. He tries to pit them against each other. And in the spring of 1622, he hatched his plot, Squanto. He told the colonists, the Pilgrims, that Massasoit was planning to double cross them and to break this alliance agreement that they had made around Thanksgiving time. And he goes, he's going to double cross you. And he says that he's planning on leading a joint attack on Plymouth with the enemies to the west. Remember, Massasoit was really worried about this tribe. It's called the I butcher this Narragansett. I don't know. It's this enemy tribe to the west. Massasoit was really worried that this Indian tribe was going to try to overrun and take over his Wampanoags. He's worried about that. So he Squanto says Massasoit is going to attack you with the Western Indian tribe, and they're planning on attacking Plymouth. And he attempted to trick the Pilgrims into attacking Massasoit. This Squanto guy is really messed up. It didn't work largely because in the event, cooler heads prevailed. But when Massasoit actually learned of Squanto's failed plot, he demanded that the Pilgrims hand him over for execution. Okay, so at this point, Squanto was taken prisoner because he was trying to get them to go attack Massasoit, and the Pilgrims have him, Squanto, and Massasoit was like, "Whoa, he just almost pitted us against each other. I want Squanto, and I want him for execution. I'm going to kill him." And the Pilgrims actually, because they're cooler heads and they're peaceful people and they're not savages, they refused to hand over Squanto to Massasoit. So Massasoit, enraged at this point, cut off all contact with Plymouth, including trade, a move that hit Plymouth pretty hard, especially hard amid a drought that summer, that withered away all of their crops, and Squanto would never again leave Plymouth without an escort, and he died shortly thereafter uh, on, on return from a diplomatic trip to the Southeast Cape Cod. So anyway, the as for Massasoit and the Wampanoags, their peace with the Pilgrims lasted about 50 years until 1675, when one of the Massasoit sons actually launched an attack and triggered a conflict that would encompass all of New England. So the Europeans actually won that in large part because by then they had outnumbered the Indians. Okay, so groups like the Western Indian tribe that were the enemies of the Massasoits tribe, the Wampanoags. Um, there was this 1616. The people who were spared by the 1616 epidemic were actually crushed by a smallpox epidemic 1633. So there was all kinds of epidemics, and really sickness killed off the Indian populations. Okay, a third to half of the remaining Indians in New England died with this 1633 epidemic of smallpox. Their societies were destroyed by weapons their opponents could not control. Okay, the Pilgrims did not kill them. They didn't go in and kill them. A lot of it was just because the Indians were so bad at staying alive and battling sickness. So the Indians were not wiped out by the Pilgrims, by the white people, like we're told. Um, they were wiped out largely by disease. Now, the Europeans, they mainly won this war that was launched by Massasoit's son 50 years after this Thanksgiving, this meeting, this peace with the Pilgrims, until 1675. So, yeah, there that we were told so many different lies in school. The societies were destroyed by weapons their opponents could not control and did not even know they had. The Indians were not wiped out by pilgrims. The white people, they were wiped out by disease, and most battles that happened were actually started by the Indians, as I just informed you. So we're going to take a quick break. This is the Morning Buzz. I so do appreciate you listening. We are going to we're gonna review some of that. I know I went through it pretty fast. We're gonna review some more of the first Thanksgiving here on the Morning Buzz. And then a little bit later, we are probably going to get into the 60th anniversary of JFK's assassination because yesterday was the 60th anniversary. And this is the day that I point to when this is the day they took our country away from us. When people are sitting here scratching their heads, how did we get here? I really think that this was the starting point of our country being taken away from us, and the powers that be decided that we, the people, could not govern ourselves or should not govern ourselves. I'm back next. Thanks so much for tuning in. I so do appreciate it. If you guys are watching, go ahead and smash that like button. We're going to come back and we are going to kind of do a quick wrap up of the first Thanksgiving story. I do want to hit this first meeting at Plymouth and how it almost ended in bloodshed one more time because I went through it really quick. And then JFK, his assassination, folks, was 60 years ago yesterday, November 22nd, 1963, is when that happened. And people are always scratching their heads. They're like, man, how did our country go to hell? I point to this day. This is the anniversary, and really, I look at it as a day where our country was taken away from us. This is the day where the powers that be decided that we, the people, should not and could not govern ourselves. So they couldn't allow a nationalist populist president to take the reins and to steer us away from things like war, globalism, world domination, and instead institute real freedom, real elections. They didn't want any of that. So JFK's assassination really represents the birth of big government. That's next in the buzz. Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks so much for tuning in. I so do appreciate it. And I went through that very, very fast. So we are going to kind of break it down a little bit and summarize um, the first meeting at Plymouth, where this almost ended in bloodshed. And, a lot of us, we look back at this and at Thanksgiving and we're told things in school and we're told uh, a lot of untruths, uh, a lot of falsehoods about Thanksgiving. So whether we realize it or not, we've got this image in our head about the first Thanksgiving, and it's kind of like this cartoon thing that we were taught in school. And it's the autumn of 1621, and a group of buckle-shoed pilgrims and stoic yet friendly Indians feasted together after a successful autumn harvest, and that's just not true. There was no friendship really between their two peoples. In the actual history of the first Thanksgiving is, of course, nothing like the grade school version that we were taught. Really, I think we were taught this multicultural narrative of peaceful Indians and well meaning pilgrims living together in harmony. Uh, because it was just indoctrination, and it's this multicultural narrative, and they are revising history. And what happened at Plymouth in December of 1620. I mean, after they did that, after the Pilgrims founded and landed in Plymouth in December of 1620, what happened later uh, was was not at all what we were taught in school. So, in November, on this November day at Plymouth, Massasoit, and I've been talking about him a lot. He was a political leader. He sent a couple of interpreters over to the Pilgrim settlement. Now, we talked about how Massasoit allowed these pilgrims to stay, and they never allowed European trailers or traders before that to stay. They never really allowed anybody to have permanent settlements. And the reason for that was because the reason why he allowed the Pilgrims to permanently settle there or to settle there was because there was a transactional relationship going on. Massasoit, he was in a bind. There was this problem he had. The enemies to the west of him, a different Indian tribe, the Narragansett, Narragansett, and I'm butchering these pronunciations, but this Indian tribe to the west of them, they were the enemies, and he was worried that they were going to overrun his weakened people. And he took the gamble and he let the Pilgrims stay because the Pilgrims actually had, things like copper kettles and steel knives and hatchets. And they would go and they would trade their fur with the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims loved the fur. In comparison today, uh, I gave the comparison of going to a kiosk, going up with your old socks, giving this guy your old socks, your dingy old socks, and then him giving you an iPhone in return. That's essentially what was going on here. And this was a strictly transactional relationship. It was a political relationship. He needed the Pilgrims to stay, and he wanted them to stay, and his plan was to get the Pilgrims to stay as long as they allied with Massasoit and the Wampanoags, They were an Indian tribe that he was the leader of, really, and he wanted them to ally with each other, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags, against this Western Indian tribe that he was worried was going to overrun them. So Massasoit, he sent these two interpreters to this pilgrim settlement on November 22nd, 1621. And the first man was named Semoset. And this was an interpreter who Massasoit actually trusted. He never trusted Tisquantum, who is better known as Squanto. Now, Squanto, you might recognize that name a little bit. He's always portrayed in our textbooks as this friendly Indian who, this friendly Indian who taught the pilgrims how to plant corn and how to fertilize their crops with fish. That's not true at all. Squanto was a member of the Patuxet tribe uh, of the Wampanoag Confederation, and he encountered the pilgrims after a long and harrowing journey of his own. So Squanto here, he's got a bit of a backstory, and it kind of explains who he is and how much vengeance he had in his heart. But 7 years before the first Thanksgiving, so 7 years before the first Thanksgiving, Squanto was actually captured by British sailors and sold into slavery in Spain. And he eventually was freed by some good Catholics, Roman Catholic priests, and they freed him. And he made his way to London, where he learned English and how he was able to be an interpreter. He actually knew English. And he served as kind of a living conversation piece in England in this rich man's house. Okay, so he was no longer a slave. He just lived in this rich guy's house and he was a conversation piece. Um, Squanto, eventually he arranged for his passage back to North America, and he came back. He wanted to come back to Pawtucket. That was in Massachusetts about a year and a half before Massasoit's meeting with the Pilgrims. He came back and he found that his entire tribe had been wiped out by disease. And I explained that this morning, how that tribe was wiped out. I mean, and as Charles Mann explained it in his book, his 2005 book, 1491, uh, he explained this as a cemetery 200 miles long and 40 miles deep. This was really sad for Squanto to come back and to not have his social world. It had vanished, and not a single person remained. So Squanto was not there for these diseases. Okay, these epidemics that happened. And like I said, the Indian people, they were socialists. There was a reason why they died in the Pilgrims who settled in Plymouth. They didn't die off completely. Now, they did die from sickness and exposure to the elements, but they actually did pretty well considering that they took a risk, a huge sacrifice to come to the New World and settle because they were fleeing religious persecution. But anyway, so Patuxet, this is Squanto's homeland, and he comes back, it's completely wiped out, and he actually, with nowhere left to go, presented himself to Massasoit, this Indian leader, and Massasoit did not trust him. Okay, he was held in captivity since his arrival to Massasoit after he presented himself, and Massasoit actually monitored him very closely, and he would not let him go negotiate with the Europeans on his own. So he actually sent two interpreters to this first meeting. So now this first meeting is really where this Thanksgiving Day comes from. So on this November day in Plymouth, Massasoit and Somerset, these two interpreters, or Massasoit sent these two interpreters, Somerset and Squanto, ahead while he and the rest of the Indian party kept out of sight. Ooh, and what followed was actually this very tense encounter, a battle, if you will. And this battle could have really abruptly ended the Pilgrims' mission of settling in this new world, fleeing England's religious persecution. This was the whole reason why the Pilgrims came to the New World. They could have been wiped out, but they weren't, and I'll get to that here in a second. But Somerset and Squanto, they spoke with the Pilgrims for about an hour. They spoke with them, and I don't know. This is kind of fuzzy, but they either gave a signal, or perhaps Massasoit, the political leader, the Indian leader, simply was following this prearranged schedule. In any case, what wound up happening was Massasoit and the Indian party they appeared out of nowhere, without warning, at the crest of the hill on the south bank of the creek. So they met at this creek, the two interpreters and some pilgrims, and they appeared out of nowhere without warning. And they ran through the foreigners' camp, and they started destroying things. And alarmed by Massasoit's sudden entrance and this killing of these pilgrims, the Europeans withdrew. They withdrew to the hill on the opposite bank, and there they had a few cannons. They had a few cannons, and they had a half-finished stockade, and this standoff ensued. So there was a battle. So this battle kinda ended once, and this was just, common, where people would be offered up as hostages. So Edward Winslow, a true hero, he would later serve as a governor of Plymouth Colony. He is also the co-author here. He gave his account of this first Thanksgiving, this day. But Edward Winslow, he gave himself up as a hostage. He waded into the creek. He walks into the creek wearing this full suit of armor and carrying this sword. Edward did. And he, through Squanto, offered himself up as a hostage. He goes, "Take me, stop the fighting." And I mean, just think about that. I mean, I'm just getting choked up thinking about how awesome these people were. Um, and he offers himself up. He says, "Take me, let's stop the fighting." So Massasoit actually accepted this, and along with Squanto and 20 of his other men, Squanto's 20 other men, they crossed over the creek into the Pilgrim settlement. And there is where this historic meeting actually took place. After negotiations and this alliance agreement, the Thanksgiving feast happened, but the schemes continued. Okay, this is the part that really irks me because we were never told this part of the story. Now we were told a revisionist version of that part I just explained. Now we were never, I've never heard this before in my life. Squanto, he had plans to actually reestablish the remaining Patuxet and convince the other Wampanoags or Wampanoags that he would be a better leader than Massasoit. So Squanto, like I said, he's a really messed up individual. I mean, sold into slavery, comes back, his whole family's dead, or his whole social world is destroyed and vanished, and he's got to be pretty messed up after that. So, here's what he tried to do: he tried to play the Pilgrims and Massasoit against each other. And in the spring of 1622, this is after the Thanksgiving feast. In the spring of 1622, or 2022, he told the colonists in Massasoit, he told the colonists that Massasoit was planning to double cross them and lead a joint attack on Plymouth with the Western Indian tribe that Massasoit was actually not happy with. He was afraid. This is the whole reason why he let the Pilgrims settle there and not absolutely wipe them out like all the other European traders that had come before the Pilgrims. He allowed the Pilgrims to stay because he had something to politically gain from it and really economically gain from it because they brought things like copper kettles and things like that. So Massasoit, or well, Squanto told the colonists that Massasoit was going to double cross them, and he was going to, and really what Squanto did, he was attempting to trick the Pilgrims into attacking Massasoit before Massasoit attacked them. But Massasoit never had plans to attack the Pilgrims. This did not work. Largely because cooler heads prevailed. Squanto was a weirdo, and Massasoit learned of Squanto's failed plot, and he demanded that the Pilgrims hand him back over for execution. Okay, and the Pilgrims actually refused to because that wasn't of their way. They didn't want Squanto to die. And Massasoit, enraged at this point, he cut off all contact with Plymouth, including trade, and that was a huge hit to the Pilgrims amid a drought that happened that summer. And Squanto, his story, I mean, he eventually died in captivity. They kept him in captivity, but they did not execute him. The Pilgrims did because they were a peaceful people and they let him keep his life. They fed him. Now, Massasoit and the Wampanoags, their peace with the Pilgrims lasted for 50 years. Okay, so they cut off all contact, but that doesn't mean that they weren't peaceful with them. This peace lasted 50 years until 1675. Guess who starts it all? It's Massasoit's son. He launches an attack, and this triggers a conflict that just pulls in all of New England. And the Europeans eventually won. And this was because the Indians, like I said, they were socialists and they sucked at living. So there was this epidemic in 1616. Indian groups, they were spared by this epidemic in 1616, and there was a very few Indians. And they were crushed later by this smallpox epidemic in 1633. So a third to half of the remaining Indians in New England died uh, because of uh, because of disease. I mean, they died really not at the hands of the Pilgrims, the white people. They died because of disease mainly. Now, there was a war, there was a conflict, and the reason why the conflict happened was because Massasoit's son was a jackwagon. And he started this huge conflict that pulled in all of New England, and the Europeans won because, frankly, they did better at life. They just lived according to the Mayflower Compact, which was, as I told you, derived from biblical teachings and the Old Testament, New Testament, and it was really just capitalism versus socialism. And because these Indians uh, were socialists, they ultimately died because people weren't able to feed themselves to stay nourished, to stay alive, uh, because it didn't matter how much you worked. You got the same amount of food as everybody else, and it just wasn't sustainable. And really, at the end of the day, it wasn't the white people with the weapons that killed these people. It was their own one, aggression, two, disease, and starvation. I'm back next. Morning, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in. I so do appreciate it. We're going to be back here live on air with the radio friends. And like I said, we've been talking a little bit about the revisionist history of the first Thanksgiving. And, the Pilgrims, they were an amazing people. They fled religious persecution, and they fled from underneath the Church of England ruled King James the First. He was persecuting anyone who did not believe in the authority of the church, and they fled on the Mayflower. They created their own rules. They landed in Plymouth, at Plymouth Rock, and I mean, what we were taught in school is nothing like what happened. And if you want to realize it or not, or come to terms with it, we've got this image of Thanksgiving, and it's more or less the a cartoon we were taught in grade school, the autumn of 1621, where a bunch of buckle-shoed pilgrims got together with some friendly Indians, and they feasted over a successful autumn harvest, and they worked together, and they had this friendship that was not at all. The actual history of the first Thanksgiving is, of course, nothing like that. It's far more interesting, far more complex. And I went through it this morning with you. And, I this morning I'm thankful that I didn't have to be the Edward Winslow, who served as governor later at Plymouth, of this Plymouth colony, and where he offered himself up as a hostage. Um, so I'm back. This is the morning buzz. A lot of people they don't want to come to terms with this, but this whole image that we have of the first Thanksgiving is more or less a cartoon that we were taught in grade school. And, it wasn't a bunch of buckle shoed pilgrims and friendly Indians getting together to feast together after this successful autumn harvest. No, 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 no. This was not a friendship. It was not a friendship between their two peoples. The actual history of the first Thanksgiving is, of course, nothing like this grade school story, and we've talked about it. We've talked about how interesting it is, how complex it is. And on the line with me to say thank you to you, the listeners, Kev Ferris from Speechless. Kev, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great, Kat. I just got done with a 5K up in Naperville, the turkey trot. Got to work off those calories before an amazing Thanksgiving dinner tonight with my family. But I wanted to make sure I call in after that run and just tell you guys how thankful I am to you, Kat, to DPB, to Ty Smith, to all of our talent here at Cities for continuously fighting the fight. But most importantly, the listeners, everybody that's out there listening. Thank you so much. The only reason why we are able to combat the woke leftist narrative on Thanksgiving is because of the support we get from you, the listeners. So thank you so much to each and every one of you. And thank God for this beautiful Thanksgiving. I just wanted to call in and say that, Kat, because you guys are the best.
We are so thankful to you, Kev Ferris, and have a great Thanksgiving with your family. Peace be to you and your family. And I'm so grateful for you and for David Paul, for Ty Smith, for the folks here who allow me to do the job that I do every morning with you. So happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to Kev. Shoot him a message. He's got a Facebook page as well. Just look it up. It's Speechless Cities 92.9 and shoot him over a message and say thank you for producing this great content. And it wouldn't be made possible without you, the listeners who consume that content. So I do want to tell you guys, this morning and this afternoon, just say thank you to God. Say thanks to the people and pray about those who came to the New World. I'm thinking a lot about Edward Winslow, who we learned about today. He later served as the governor of this Plymouth colony, and he waded into that creek wearing a full suit of armor and carrying a sword, and he offered himself as hostage through Squanto, this Indian. And Massasoit, this political leader, this Indian leader who was calculating and cunning and not very nice. But Squanto was even worse, in my opinion. But Massasoit, he accepted this hostage, and with this hostage, they were able to cross over the creek into the Pilgrim settlement. And there was this historic meeting that took place. There was negotiations. There was an alliance agreement to where they would stop battling it out. It was an ambush. The Indians ambushed the Pilgrims, and that's really what happened on that Thanksgiving morning. They were ambushed, and these two interpreters were sent by Massasoit, that political Indian leader. And I'm glad that we talked about the true story, the first Thanksgiving. And I don't think it shocks you that it was nothing like what you were taught in school. All right, folks, you have a blessed Thanksgiving, and thank you, and thanks for tuning in every morning. Be sure to tune in tomorrow morning. Signing off. Love you. Bye bye.